Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of In the Eyes of Truth. Today with us is Mary Dejevsky. She is a writer, broadcaster on foreign affairs, a former correspondent in Moscow, as well as Paris and Washington. Um, uh, After Washington, I'm sure that was the, maybe had to take a long shower after leaving Washington. Nice museums. I'll say that much for it. So, Mary, welcome to the program. If
Thank you.
you'd like to tell a little bit more to the audience about yourself.
Hey there, entrepreneurs. Are you feeling the squeeze from increasing regulations and higher taxes? Maybe you've noticed the growing instability and thought there has to be a better way. Well, you're not alone, and that's exactly why you need to consider offshoring your wealth now. Imagine a life where your hard-earned money isn't constantly under threat from unpredictable government policies. Sounds pretty good, right? Let me tell you. It's not just a dream, it's a smart strategy. Here at Exit Strategy, we specialize in helping entrepreneurs like you protect and grow their wealth. We navigate the complex world of international finance so you don't have to, from setting up offshore accounts to advising on the best countries with favorable tax laws. We've got you covered. Now, I know what you're thinking. Offshoring sounds risky, maybe even a bit shady, but the truth is many savvy business owners are already doing it. It's not just about dodging taxes, it's about creating a safety net for your future. Imagine diversifying your assets across multiple jurisdictions. When one country faces economic downturns, your wealth remains secure. Think of it as an insurance policy against the uncertainties of life. And let's not forget, having a portion of your wealth offshore can open up opportunities for international investments. You're no longer limited by the economic climate of a single country. You can tap into booming markets around the world, maximizing your returns. But here's the kicker. Time is of the essence. With increasing global scrutiny and tightening regulations, the window for easy offshoring is closing fast. The sooner you act, the better positioned you'll be. So why wait? Protect your wealth, secure your future, and explore new opportunities with Exit Strategy. Don't let the rising dangers in the US economy catch you off guard. Reach out to us today and take the first step towards financial freedom. Because when it comes to your wealth, playing it safe is the riskiest move of all. Thanks for watching, and remember, your future starts with the decisions you make today. Choose wisely, choose Exit Strategy. Catch you in the next video.
By all means, please.
Okay, well, I mean, I write quite a lot for different British outlets
Mhm.
on different parts of the political spectrum. I have a regular slot in the London Independent, but I also write for quite unconventional outlets because I think some of the views I have don't really match the rather established and in Britain quite politicized media.
Yeah, I came across one of your videos, I guess a couple weeks ago, where you were correcting some of the journalists on, you know, Russia's the new Reich, Putin's the new Hitler,
Mhm.
and he wants to swallow all of Europe. Well, and you had a nice rebuttal to that, which I'm sure is probably the typical position most of the elites these days seem to take in the West. Uh,
I should probably, maybe I should also say that my connection with Russia goes back to when I was at school in the 1960s in Britain, when Harold Wilson was Prime Minister, and he said that every British school child should learn Russian.
well,
And I was one of the ones who did. And I studied Russian at university.
mhm.
I was on a British Council exchange studentship in Voronezh for a year. And so, I speak Russian, but I'm not a native Russian or Russian
Mhm.
speaker.
So, in other words, these days you are a rare breed because it seems that most of the Russian experts have never even been to Russia. The modern Russian experts, I mean.
Yes, and it's tragic. The decline of studying Russian and mastery of the Russian language among um, you know, non-Russians in Britain. I think it's an absolute catastrophe.
You know, One of the things I brought up, because I come on a lot of Russian television shows and some RT English and some of the English ones, but I do a lot of the Russian circuit for the last 2.5 years, and I'm former U.S. military. I was born in Lugansk and then came back to Russia in 2010. Just as a little background, and I was an executive in oil and gas services, so I had the experience. But my message has been to the Russian leadership is they don't know how to communicate with the West because as a Orthodox country with a Greek background as opposed to Latin background countries, they go in hints, in theories, and they don't do a straight legalistic approach. And I think that's a lot of the problems. Do you think that's an issue?
No, I absolutely agree. And the contrast between the way Russians and official representatives of Russia and unofficial representatives, how they presented their case, especially in the first part of the war against Ukraine, when at least Russians were being listened to, which isn't true now,
Yeah.
that they were so bad at presenting their case. And the trouble was that the Ukrainians were so good at it. They had a complete flair for how the Western media operated. They always had somebody prepared to talk. They had people with excellent English who were prepared to, who were capable of presenting the most positive case for Ukraine all over the English-speaking media, and it was hugely effective. And then either the Russians couldn't produce anybody, or if they did, their English wasn't good enough to sustain the conversation. And the trouble is that now I think maybe they've improved a little, but nobody, at least in the UK, to my impression, actually wants to listen. So they don't get very much access to the airwaves.
The impression in Russia was also because if you look at the way the war started, the Ukrainian army was getting ready to attack Donetsk and Lugansk again. The amount of shelling went up very hard, heavily. If they had proceeded and allowed the first blow to come in, there would have been massive casualties in Donetsk, civilian casualties, of course. But they didn't think that this was that the West actually wanted war. They thought, we do the show of force, we sit down, we negotiate, and then things go back to the way they were before.
Yeah.
We do business, everybody's fine. We've just reset the balance about 3 years ago. So, but is the West really, well, I won't say the West as a whole, it's not monolith, but is the British elite really so set on war, or is this mostly talk, bravado, or trying to deflect from internal issues?
I wouldn't say that it's trying to deflect from internal issues. I would say that it's part of a fixed mindset that's very hostile to Russia in a lot of sections of the British elite, but also that the the campaign for additional defense spending because of the change of policy in Washington, that's had a big impact in Britain, and it's put the politicians and the Labour government in a very difficult position of having not enough money for domestic causes and not enough money to raise defense spending at the same time. And my impression is that they're using Russia additionally, the threat from Russia, the prospect of a war with Russia, which is being talked about as though it's somehow a realistic proposition, which, maybe I'm wrong, but it doesn't seem to me that it is a realistic proposition. But they're using that to try to convince the British that we have to get more on a war footing, that we have to be prepared for the extra expense of defending ourselves against Russia. The interesting thing is that you referred to the elite and I referred to sections of the establishment elite. If you go further down into public opinion generally, my impression is that you come across completely different views, and that selling this idea to the British public is going to be a gigantic problem because people just don't buy it. And there's two reasons really why they don't buy it. They don't buy it suspicious of everything that the government says, which appears to be based on intelligence information since the disaster of the intervention in Iraq, which was based on false intelligence interpretation. So that has discredited a lot of things that any British government says since. And the other is that there are a lot of people who don't buy the idea that Russia is automatically a threat. When I write things which maybe call into question that idea, I get a lot of people writing, what's called under the line of commentaries, saying, yes, why don't we hear this more often? And if you look at commentaries which take a very anti-Russian view, and you look underneath, you'll find a lot of commentaries there which say, we don't actually accept this. Either we've been to Russia or we've met Russians, and we simply don't think that this is the actual position.
And this is something that always intrigued me, in that the hostility between the elites, well, particularly the English elites toward the Russian elites. I mean, it's nothing new. This goes back several hundred years. But when the British discovered us in Arkhangelsk, with the fortress of Arkhangelsk up there, and started trade negotiations, you would think that Russia and England would have been the optimal partners, because they're both on the edges of Europe, and nobody wants a very strong central power in Europe. But even starting from the times of Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Feared, not the Terrible. I hate that mistranslation. But the elite has been steadily building up anti-Russian sentiment. I know the big game, the great game, which, by the way, there's absolutely no archival evidence that the Tsars ever looked into Afghanistan as an option, or God forbid, going into India, which is way too far, stretching resources incredibly far. But the hostility has been building for well over 200 years.
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure whether it's completely true to say that it's been building in a sort of straight line. I think that there've been periods when it's been much more acute, and when it's been softer, and especially when it's maybe been diverted through closer cultural relations. And those things have sort of alternated. But when I look at, say, the last 40 or so years, in some ways, relations during the Cold War were much more structured, and there was a much more there was a sort of baseline which said that yes, Russia was sort of the enemy and the adversary, but we could deal with them, and we had relations, and there were cultural exchanges like the academic one that I was on for a year, and there were people going and training at the Bolshoi Ballet. There were all sorts of cultural exchanges, and people went both ways. Not a lot of people, but they did, and the general atmosphere, I would say, was actually not nearly as negative as the sort of Cold War expression suggests. But if you look back at the last, what is really tragic to me is that I used to write the editorials in the Times, the London Times newspaper, in the mid-80s, just as Gorbachev was coming to power, and everybody was talking about perestroika and glasnost, and Margaret Thatcher had been had good relations with Gorbachev and made a spectacular visit to Moscow, and relations were generally, I mean, they were probably as good as they've been in recent years. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, that, in a way, I mean, it was a huge opportunity. And the problem for me was that I went from having written these very hardline, tough Cold War editorials, which was what the policy of the London Times, to, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, we were obviously very positive about Gorbachev. When the Soviet Union collapsed and Yeltsin came to power, and there can be different views about Yeltsin, but my view was that this was time to drop all the Cold War cliches. I'd watched the democracy demonstrations in Russia, in Moscow. Every Saturday, people turned out with democracy demonstrations against the Communist Party, against Article 6 of the Constitution that the Communist Party had the leading role. Russia had, as well as the Soviet Union breaking up, Russia had a similar sort of democratic revolution as the East and Central Europeans had. But it seemed to me that this simply wasn't recognized in a lot of countries, and particularly it was recognized only fleetingly in Britain, which meant almost immediately back to treating Russia, post-Soviet Russia. I know Russians hate being called post-Soviet Russia, but went to treating post-Soviet Russia as though it was the direct descendant of the Soviet Union. And they kept all the cliches. And so that made it that much more difficult for Russia, in the eyes of the British establishment, to free itself from those, because they were still seen through that lens. And that I think was a huge mistake of the early 90s. And then it really only got worse when Putin became president, because Putin somehow seemed to sum up everything that the British found difficult about about Russia, and so things got much worse from 2001 onwards, and there've been very few rays of light since then.
Yeah, I agree. It was a very interesting moment because but at the same time, in 1999, I became a staff captain in the 18th Airborne Corps staff. Before that, I served at the level of brigade, company, platoon leader. And you see a very small picture. You just see your training calendar 6 months out, maybe a year out, where you're being deployed to, Bosnia, or I was a military advisor in Georgia, a place like that. So you see a very small window. But you get up to the core level and you see at least a portion of the big picture. And what honestly shocked me in 1999, except for the couple of months, and I was in G3, the operations section, except for the couple of months that we were preparing the war, the invasion of Baghdad. So the plans are already there. I mean, the plans are worked out in think tanks and the military on every single, there's a plan for every single country in the world. Most military staffs have that, big military staffs. They've got one for Mars and zombies and everything else, just because, they've got time on their hands. But once you start something, you pull that plan off the shelf, you refine it, and you prepare it. But except for that, the entire focus was war on Russia. That's it, which in the end drove me on a political reason to refuse major's rank and leave the military. But I was not going to go fight my own people. But that was the entire synthesis of everything, was war on Russia. Different terrain, different scenarios, but that's all we worked on. And this was 1999. This was, I looked in his eyes and I saw his soul, and they're our new
Yes,
best
yes.
friends, and politicians are hugging each other butt.
Yes, I mean that was when I was based in Washington in those years, and that's exactly the contradiction there was there, and but somehow the opportunities of those years they were simply not picked up. And I don't know why that went so badly wrong. Because I mean, there were various efforts when I think Tony Blair had an effort to get on to get on with Gorbachev, and there was a completely ridiculous and really ill-judged meeting where the Blairs went out to the Gorbachev's dacha, and they rode around I think in open cars, and they had Gorbachev and Blair, and then they had Mrs. Blair and Raisa Gorbachev. And the problem was that nobody had actually asked whether Raisa and Mrs. Blair actually spoke a common language. And the answer was that they didn't. So
Uh, the oops moment. So, but and then well, Yeltsin was God, as an American, as a Russian in America, Yeltsin was an embarrassment. It was an incredible embarrassment. But that's what all Russians were portrayed of, as this drunken lout, smacking his some secretary on the butt, coming out stumbling off of a plane. It was a horrible, horrible time for
but that sort of happened, but it was also sort of not exactly covered up, but it was sort of excused because Yeltsin was so sort of important to the Western world that those sort of weaknesses were that they were played down. And they were, as you said, they were sort of passed off as though they were, this was sort of typical Russian behavior. So, but basically, he's our guy. So, we'll leave.
As you remember, Britain actually, the British military, and hats off to them. And I worked some with them in Bosnia, mostly Scots actually. They were a Scottish unit, fine guys, fine fellows. Sat at a bar with them drinking afterwards. It was they had no problems. Well, again, I was in the U.S. military, but they had no problems with me being Russian too. It was everything was very cordial, friendly. But when the uh, when the NATO was bombing Yugoslavia, and then NATO proceeded into Pristina, as we recall, uh, General Clark, when he found out that there were Russian soldiers in the Pristina airport, gave an order to kill them, and it was General Green from well, it was Her Majesty's Royal Army at that point that said, "No, I'm not starting World War III for your ego." And it was a British
Yeah.
lieutenant that said, "No, I'm not going to start firing on the
Yes.
Russians."
Yes.
And they were the brake on American, well, on American general staff idiocracy. But it just seems like it's changed so much since then. Almost the opposite now.
Well, I think the standoff at Pristina airport is a very, very interesting example because, you're saying, well, it was the British commanders that actually stopped that, hugely high risk encounter. Um, and it was the British who understood the dire consequences of that if there'd actually been a clash. But it also has to be said that my understanding is that that decision was taken by the commanders on the ground against the orders or recommendations from London. That this was decided not exactly against orders, but that it was decided in the light of the circumstances as they were at Pristina airport, and that it wasn't at all well received in London. And that when the troops, when the senior officers went back to London, that was actually a problem for them. What had happened at
Hmm.
Pristina airport, that it wasn't seen as a voice of sanity.
That's very sad. I was quite hoping the other way, that the political class actually supported
Well, that's my
the military did.
understanding. It may not be so.
Yeah, that's I organized I think they can say the only and it was amazing because I was a first lieutenant at that point. I organized the only live fire exercise between U.S. Russian and British soldiers and this was ever, I think, ever. This was in Glomach in southwestern Bosnia. I was sent there by my colonel to support the Russian troops who were part of our contingent when they were firing. I'd been on the brigade staff, then I went into the infantry, ran away from the brigade, so I became VP of or XO, let me phrase that. In military terms, XO of a company, and then I got pulled back up because I was in a transportation officer mode to move us back to Germany. We said, hey, there's a separate mission. We'll take you down, support the Russians. I get down there. There's a whole plan between U.S. and Russians to do a live fire exercise to intimidate the local Croatian leadership, but you can't say that's politically correct. So you have to bring in the media and make a big show of it. And since I was using, my colonel looked at me, it's like, are you ready? I'm like, well, I can't say no. So I'm like, okay, I'm stuck here for the next 2 weeks. Wasn't expecting that, but I'm running around, and I went to use the satellite phone, satellite radio at the British base, because the American base was just a couple tents, a dozen tents, and the British had a full base. And I went and used that, and the officer, like I said, I was in the bar afterwards drinking. I commandeered a pickup truck from a consultant, which probably would have cost me my career if I didn't know about it. But hey, do what you need to do. And I'm drinking a beer, and the British go, oh, you're doing this? Oh, we want to participate too. So, right there, man. And it was that moment. It was 1998.
Mhm.
No, I'm sorry, 1997, toward the end of 1997. I think it was September or October. And it was just this moment, and all three parties there that we had the roles, who comes in when, shoots what, the media's all seeing that. They got the back of my head for like 10 seconds. The generals got all the credit, of course. But but it was such a moment because everybody's talking. Everybody afterwards, we had a big feast. I set a big feast up for General Meigs and General Spock, who was the commander of all Russian Air Force or airborne units. They came in with their staffs, lifted up 2 shots of vodka, and left. Giant table full of food. I'm like, God. And General Horden, 1-star American general, comes over there. Get everybody, son, even the sergeants, get them all here. So British, Russians, Americans are all sitting at a table just getting drunk and eating everything. Such a great moment. And then,
Mhm. No, those things fade into the past, and
yeah, very unfortunate. Well, what about the UK right now? Because, last time I was in London was 2014, and it was a huge difference from the previous in 2013. And none of them looks anything like in the 1990s when I was in London. And it's just, it's a whole different city. Uh,
Mhm. In what respect?
well, it's not English. Let's begin with that.
Well,
And
I
it's
think
much scarier than it used to be.
well, it's certainly, I mean, they would say it's very ethnically diverse. Um, and it's probably become more so, not just in the last 20 years, but in the last 5 years as well, since we left the European Union. Because during the European Union, mostly the people who were coming in were from other parts of Europe, but especially from East and Central Europe. Whereas when free movement stopped, when we left the European Union, then migration didn't stop, but instead it came from mostly from former British colonies and from other parts of the world than Europe. So yes, I would say that London does look quite a bit different. But if you've lived here all that time, then you haven't really noticed it because it's been quite a gradual change. Um, there, one of the things that you notice is that the actual shift of ethnic ethnic trends, if you like, where, if you look back 30 years or so, then the restaurants, you were talking about Chinese restaurants, and you were talking about Indian, Pakistani, South Asian restaurants. And now, to an extent, that is that those the first generation are passing on to the next generation, and what you have is some very stylish, quite expensive South Asian restaurants. The Chinese restaurants are declining. There's far fewer of them than there used to be. You're looking at other parts of South Asia, or you're looking even at things like Ethiopian and even, Middle Eastern, and that you can see in, if you look at the sort of the restaurant trends alone, tell you about the shifting patterns of migration into London. But London, it has to be said, is quite an exception. If you go outside London, depending where you go, obviously, then things look quite different. And if, in particular, I mean, if you go to Scotland, you would certainly think that London was a completely different country.
I've been to Aberdeen a couple times. So yeah, it is a it reminded me more of what you would expect, you know.
Yes.
I mean, it's been a few years since then too, but it was yes, very different from London. Is this bleeding out into the surrounding countryside? Are the people being displaced? The locals, I'm talking about the
Well,
British.
I think there's some evidence. Everybody's very careful about
Hmm.
talking about what they call white flight, as to whether the white British population has been leaving London. And there's some evidence that yes, that's happened, but also that it was accelerated during the pandemic.
Hmm.
That anybody who had an alternative not to be in London really tried to leave London, and some people stayed and some people started coming back. But there's another aspect to this, which is that house prices in London have been so high that families with children have often moved out to have more space in smaller places. And the result of that is that suddenly there's almost a panic about the lack of children in the central parts of London. And schools are closing because there aren't enough school-age children, especially very young children, that they're having to close schools, and people are saying that the sort of centre of London is becoming a sort of child-free district, and
That's
it's
horrible.
certainly true that there isn't the sort of natural age range that you would see in, say, a provincial town in London.
Yeah, that's horrible. Uh, I've been in place. Well, Italy. Italy is a prime example. I used to work for an Italian company, so I spent a lot of time in Milan, and there are very few children compared to what should be, and
Mm-hmm.
it lacks the energy. You know, it just there's no that not that youthful energy. It's like a
Mm.
dying society. I mean, that's what it feels like. Unfortunate to say, but I mean that's. What do you think? How do we de this and how do we lower the pressure? How do we disengage from this continual escalation? We're on an escalation ladder, obviously, and it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't lead anywhere good. Uh, best it's a kinetic war, worse it's a nuclear war. Neither one is good. What would you say, or do you think that is it even possible between Russia and the UK to de-escalate?
Well, I think that one aspect of de-escalation is that at the popular level, there's not been the same amount of escalation and sort of fear and hostility that there is at the establishment and elite level. And it's not clear to me how far the elite will actually be able to persuade everybody else of the magnitude of the Russian threat as they're trying to present it. So that's that's one maybe hopeful sort of common sense sort of aspect of it. But at the political level, one of the things that I find interesting, worrying, but also maybe has slight seeds of hope, is that when Donald Trump came to office, saying that he was going to settle the Ukraine war within 24 hours or a week or a month or whatever, that what happened in Europe was almost the opposite. And when Trump put out his first phone call to Putin, there was enormous hostility. at the top of most West European countries. Not at, not at the public level, I would say, but at the top. And that was certainly the idea that Trump had actually picked up the phone and talked to Putin to break the isolation which the West had tried to enforce ever since February 22. And the what struck me, and what I actually thought was a very, very bad idea, was that the Europeans, and the British in particular, tried to galvanize the Europeans into mounting an almost resistance effort against the overtures that Trump was making. And so there were all these meetings. You probably remember that scarcely a week went by without some meeting at the Elysee or at Downing Street or Lancaster House or somewhere, usually in London or Paris, trying to get together some group of Europeans, and it was generally different sort of compositions of groups, who would be prepared both to pledge to replace the amount of weapons and other supplies that the Americans were sending to Ukraine, and to enable the war to continue, to help the Ukrainians to carry on fighting. So we had this, to me, very strange and not desirable spectacle of Trump appearing to make overtures towards some sort of peace on the war, ending the war on the one hand, and the Europeans doing their utmost to continue this war. Now, what seems to have happened since then is that the European effort basically failed. That they weren't able to produce a convincing plan that would actually replace the amount of weapons and financial help being sent by the Americans. And they couldn't persuade enough Europeans to be prepared to send their troops to Ukraine, whether in a peacekeeping capacity or to help the war or anything. They couldn't even decide how to do it. They had this nice little code called the Coalition of the Willing, because they knew that not all of the Europeans would sign up. But I think one of the big reasons why it failed was because one of the biggest supporters of Ukraine in Europe and in the European Union and in NATO is Poland. And Poland made it very clear almost from the beginning of this process that, yes, it thought it was a great idea. It was not the right time for a ceasefire, not the right time for talks. But was Poland prepared to send troops to join any coalition of the willing? Absolutely not. They said they'd got enough work to do defending their own territory on the eastern border, and they weren't going to. Now, if Poland was not prepared to send troops, then you are missing a big contingent out of Europe. And if you don't have Poland on side for that particular aspect, then it's very hard to see how you're going to be able to replace the Americans if the Americans stop or suspend their support to Ukraine. So I think gradually what we're seeing is a sort of moving very gradually of the words, if not the actual reality of what the Europeans are saying, towards an American position of saying, yes, we really want peace. Yes, there should be talks, but no, we can't agree to the conditions as they currently are. So I think, on the one hand, we saw this spectacular divide between the US and Europe, and we're now watching it very slowly and with some difficulty getting narrower. But I mean, they're still not part of the same effort, which I think they should have been from the very beginning. I think that Trump's totally unrealistic
24 hours
that he could win. But his task was made much more difficult by the attitude of the Europeans. And I had to smile earlier this week because the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte was speaking in London. And at one point, he said he really welcomed the talks between Trump and Putin. And I nearly jumped out of my chair because the hostility towards Trump's first overtures to Putin was extraordinary.
Yeah.
And yet, talking to Russia was absolutely essential for breaking the sort of logjam that happened over Ukraine.
Mary,
And
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt. We are almost out of time. We've
okay.
got like 30 seconds left. It doesn't.
Okay.
It just shows less than a minute on the last minute. Unfortunately, I'm sorry. Yeah, I want to thank everybody that joined us. I want to thank Mary for joining us. Very enlightening, because we don't hear enough from the European side, unfortunately, particularly the British, who are playing a major role one way or the other in this crisis. Thank you, everybody. If you have commentary, you have